All right, I think we're going to get going. Hello, everybody. Thanks very much for joining. I'm sure some folks will continue to come in. We're here to chat about integrating your line of business systems with Microsoft 365. Myself, I'm Logan Guest. I'm our sales and marketing manager at Envision IT. So I get to work with lots of clients and as well as partners on these different sorts of integration projects. And then if we want to progress to the next slide. Just some quick Teams meeting etiquette. This is a regular Teams meeting. Feel free to chat throughout the webinar. I know Peter likes questions, making it more of an open dialogue. Please stay on mute. If you'd like to join the conversation, please ask on chat and we can invite you in. And most importantly, enjoy the content and hopefully you'll learn a thing or two. Just for some quick background, Envision IT is a Microsoft 365 consulting and custom development company. So we spend a lot of time around modern workplace, records management, intranets, extranets, forms and workflows, these sorts of enterprise integration projects. Predominantly, starting early on with SharePoint and then moving into the full Microsoft suite. Since then, we're also a recognized Microsoft Gold partner, and we've won some awards along the way. So I'll hand it over to Peter to introduce and go through the remainder of the content.
Cool. Thanks, Logan. Peter Carson here, president of Envision IT, also Office Apps and Services MVP with Microsoft. Do a lot of speaking and conferences and such. It's funny, I was looking at this picture as I was doing the dry run through. I actually went to a in-person conference in New York City last week and put a suit on for the first time, and I don't remember how long. So yes, I am in shorts at home today, but welcome to the online version here as we go through. We're going to be sharing a copy of the deck and the recordings. You'll have my contact info, Logan's contact info in there as part of that as well. So quick agenda of what we want to cover off today. We've started with the introductions. We're going to start sort of a background of what's involved in looking at your enterprise systems, what would an assessment look like, and what does a modern solution architecture look like. We're actually going to spend most of the time in customer scenarios. We've actually got a pretty packed agenda here. I've got a lot of cool different things I want to show you. We're not going to go super deep. We are going to get technical. Don't be afraid if you're not a coder. I'll try and do my best to explain in English and keep it making sense from that point of view. But really the goal here is to show you how you can, the art of the possible, how you can wire your different systems in your organization together so that they work more effectively and you get more value out of them as that. And ultimately, what a phase roadmap would look like. As Logan mentioned, drop questions into chat as we're going through. By all means, I may or may not see as I'm watching. I do have it on another monitor. But I can pause for a breath and ask Logan to clarify if we've got questions through there. So just starting with an enterprise systems assessment, and this isn't something that you have to hire us to do. It's really something organizations should be doing regardless in terms of looking at what are the systems they're using today and what does a roadmap look like down the road through there. And and more clients are using Microsoft 365, so they're in the cloud. They may have a CRM like Dynamics 365 or Salesforce. They may have SAP, say, as an ERP, or other vendors or custom line of business systems as part of the way that they do business. And one of the challenges that we see with a lot of organizations when we do these assessments is that these have grown organically. They may have different business owners within the organization, and this concept of a system or record may not really be in place. If we take a simple example like contact information, how many different places do you have that? Is it in Outlook? Is it in CRM? Is it in your ERP? Is it in your custom systems? Is it in your email marketing? There's lots of different places where that can be. And getting to a single version of the truth is often a challenge. So how do you cleanse that data? How do you define what place is the master record for that? And then how do you build those integrations so that that stays current and that all those other various systems are up to date through those integrations? And it's not something you can necessarily go straight to and say, hey, we're going to pick one system of record for our contacts, for example, and update the half a dozen other systems so they all refer to that. That could be a big job, and you do need to think about how do we phase that out over time, and how do we sort of build a roadmap to build that integration. The other part of this is thinking about a modern solution architecture. We hear the word modern a lot from Microsoft these days with their modern collaboration and modern workplace. That's really how people use and consume Microsoft 365 and how they do their day-to-day work. But when you think about modern solution architecture, it's that same concept of cloud first. How do we make this migration to the cloud? And very few organizations are 100% in the cloud. I mean, we're a consulting organization. We're pretty bleeding edge. So we shut down the last of our on-premise systems a couple of years ago. We were almost done before COVID hit, and we decommissioned our racks and got rid of all our servers and everything over the last 2 years or so. So, it's a great goal, and a lot of organizations in the past, may have felt that, hey, it's cheaper or it's more secure to keep our stuff on premises. Neither of those arguments tend to hold much water these days. The security in the cloud is typically better than what you do on premise, and the price from the hyperscale that the vendors, whether it's Microsoft and Azure or it's Amazon Web Services or other vendors, the economics make a lot of sense from that point of view as well. And the other part of modern solution architecture is, how do we move away from writing reams and reams of code to build these integrations? What are the more modern tools that we can use from an integration point of view that make it simpler from that perspective? And there's a lot of debate around this topic. When Microsoft brought their Power Platform out, it was really targeted to what they call the power user, hence the name as part of that. And what we found over time, Microsoft has realigned that. They said, well, it's not power user anymore. Now it's citizen developer, because they recognize that, the average user, this was sort of beyond their capabilities. So, how do we balance that and say, what can the business owner do themselves? What should IT and sort of full-time developers do? And the approach that we're going to be talking about here today is really more on the developer side. But how do we still leverage a lot of that tooling that Microsoft's provided to keep it low code? Even as developers, as much as they may want to love writing code, if we can do it without doing that, it does make it easier to implement, easier to maintain from that point of view. The other thing is how do we design an architecture that protects us from change? Change is inevitable. It's going to happen in every organization. Your accounting system may change. You may bring in a new ERP system, even from the same vendor. A new version has a big impact to organizations. How do you isolate that? Things like an enterprise service bus, which is basically a structure that you built in your organization for systems to talk to each other. So if you've got 6 different systems that all need to talk to each other, you don't build 36 points of integration between those 6 systems. You build a hub in the middle, and each of those 6 things talks to that one hub. And if one of those pieces changes, the other 5 don't need to know about that change, because that enterprise service bus isolates that from that point of view. And there's things like API gateways. This is a feature in Microsoft Azure that helps build that, and helps to publish so people can discover what these endpoints are and how do you do these integrations. So as you get into bigger enterprise organizations, there's some pretty interesting architectural stuff you can think about there. You can take those concepts and bring them down to a smaller organization as well. You don't have to blow up your budget and go crazy, but you can take those best practices. And then the other super important piece is from a security point of view. Gone are the days where you said, hey, we've got this, super secure firewall around our organization, and any network traffic that's inside of our organization on our domain connected physical devices that are in the office, that world is gone. Like, just accept the fact that that dike that surrounds your organization is going to get breached and broken. And, when the floodwaters come in, if the hacker's coming in, you want to know that they can't just go wild across your whole organization, so that each application that you're building and those integrations that are going between them, each, the zero trust idea says they don't trust even things within the same organization. They always need to go back to say, hey, who's calling me? Are they allowed to do what they're supposed to be doing? And that security happens as part of that. And the key to gluing that together is to have what's called an identity provider, something in your network that says, hey, whether I'm a person coming in through a computer or whether I'm another application talking to this application, how do you prove who you are and what you're allowed to do? And typically in Microsoft environments, that would be Azure Active Directory, but it can be any modern identity provider, typically OAuth or OpenID Connect. You could be using Okta or Oracle, or all the major vendors have different solutions there. The reality, though, is Azure Active Directory is included free as part of your Microsoft 365, although you may want to beef up the security and go to the premium levels on that. We strongly encourage that. And it's ubiquitous and it's there in your organization already, so might as well leverage it. Okay, so enough on the security, but bear that in mind. It's super important as you're designing this architecture. Now, from a technologies and integrations point of view, sort of left and right on this slide here, left being sort of Microsoft technology. So the top being, things that you see in Microsoft 365, which is a much bigger suite than, Teams, SharePoint, and Excel. But, those are sort of some of the key things that we see from an integrations point of view, that, we're keeping documents in SharePoint, we're doing conversations and communications in Teams. We may use Exchange Online as part of this as well. And surprisingly, if you look at most organizations, there's a scary amount of sort of business automation that happens in Excel. Sometimes it's a little frightening, the things that people wire together with hundreds of Excel worksheets. It gets a little scary. But the reality is it's a great tool, and it has a lot of application in these types of integrations as well. We're launching a number of data collection portals for clients that allow people to enter in data, bring it into a data warehouse, use Power BI, which is the lower icon, the yellow one here, to do reporting and analysis of that. That model actually works really well. In the middle here, we've got Azure Logic Apps. They're basically a way to build workflows. They're very low code. We like them a lot. There's a lot of advantage to that. I'll talk a bit more detail in a minute on that. Azure App Service is a way to host your sort of more C# code built applications in the cloud, and Microsoft takes care of all the uptime and maintenance of those for you, so that's nice. SQL, obviously we see that a lot, whether it's Microsoft SQL or other vendors and databases as part of that. Dynamics 365 from a CRM point of view, I already mentioned Power BI. But also just industry standard technologies. We're going to talk a lot about forms here, and being able to use HTML5, CSS, JavaScript to build those forms, and not having a developer need to be, a Microsoft developer or a Power Platform developer. You can hire a web stack developer that understands how to build, rich web pages with JavaScript and connect them up to backend APIs. That's awesome. That's what you need here, and that's sort of the approach that we're taking. We've hired 5 developers straight out of school over the last 2 or 3 years at Envision IT. They're awesome. They're 2 ladies, 3 gentlemen, trying to be diverse, and number of them came through sort of a formal undergrad computer engineering background, but quite a number of them came through more of a traditional liberal arts and then took a web stack post-grad program, like a 1-year program after that. And it slots in perfectly to what we're doing here from a development resource point of view. And then on the right side, non-Microsoft vendors. So, we see a lot of Salesforce, MailChimp for email distributions, Moodle and Desire to Learn are 2 platforms who are doing learning management, Training Orchestra related to that, Sage from a financial accounting point of view, lots of clients using SAP. We've done lots of integrations from that point of view. Stripe is the icon in the lower right from an e-commerce payment gateway integration perspective. So, you've got all these different pieces in your organization. If we pick any one of our clients, they typically have multiple of these. How do we wire those together? And that's really what we're going to talk about today. So I mentioned Azure Logic Apps. They're basically a workflow tool. If you're familiar with Power Automate, they're closely related. They use all the same actions and connectors. There's licensing differences and there's deployment differences. Really, I think about Logic Apps as what more of a formal IT developer would use, and Power Automate is more what a citizen developer. And they both have their application through there. I talk a bit about Power Automate here, but we're going to actually focus more on the Logic App side. And the reason for that, it's just they work better for these sorts of enterprise integrations. Yes, Power Automate is simpler for the citizen developers. When we're building solutions like these, they tend to be full developers. We've got good deployment models. We've got source control around that. Uses all the same connectors. And the other nice thing I like, maybe Microsoft doesn't like me saying this, but the pricing model is much simpler. It's a consumption pricing model. It's not per user. We don't need to worry about premium and custom connectors and premium licensing and all that. I've got the links here if you want to get into the details. Microsoft always makes it a little confusing when you get into the licensing side of things. But basically, per user or per organization versus pay for what you use from a consumption point of view. All right, so that's sort of the background side of it. Let's get into the scenarios themselves. So we're going to spend the bulk of the session here today going through these different scenarios. So I'm actually going to start with this webinar itself and the registration process that everybody went through to join this and what's happening behind the scenes as part of that. It seems pretty simple. There's actually a fair number of moving parts there. It's kind of cool when you realize what's all happening through there. Next, we're going to talk about an expense report. So, a typical employee self-service forms type of application, a simple one that we've built for internally at Envision IT, and then a more complex version of the same form that we delivered for Halton Region about a year and a half ago. Electricity Canada and Ontario Association of Children's Aid Societies are two of our clients. We've built very rich members portals that have a lot of integrations in them. So we'll talk about how that wires together. Community Living Haldeman, this is a cool one where they're using Shifts, which is a Microsoft app or product within Teams that allows you to, create shift schedules and assign them, and people can swap shifts. How do we integrate that into payroll? So we can actually take the output of shifts, feed it into reporting, and ultimately feed it into Sage from a payroll integration perspective. County Simcoe, they become less politically interesting these days because vaccine trackers have kind of gone off, but we hustled together a quick app for them to do vaccine tracking, and we can show you how that hangs together. And then last is a client of ours we did a very large claims records management solution for. So kind of saying, hey, we can take these same models and scale them to big enterprises with hundreds or thousands of users and millions of documents, and the same approach, the same solution architecture makes sense from that point of view. So let's start with the webinar registration process. So, depending on whether you discovered this organically or you came in through email marketing. Sorry, pause for water for a sec. Odds are most people probably received an email invitation that we sent out through MailChimp, which is our email marketing solution. And this is what that invitation looks like. It's got the link to register. I can click on that link and it pops me over to our public website. It does a little click tracking through MailChimp as part of that. That's a data point we can actually integrate in, and we can talk about that. But you come to the web page here. Now, one of the things we did was we customized that email that goes out to each person. And if you look carefully on the browser address bar, you'll see that all of your information, if you're looking at your email, your name, your email, this is actually a ID record back into our CRM, so we can track from that point of view. Sorry if it's creepy, but it's good from a marketing point of view to kind of organize all this. But it's also good for the person responding to this. When I click the join webinar, I don't need to refill in all my information. You send me an invitation, I want to register. You already know who I am, just pre-fill it. If I forward this email to somebody else, they could overtype this and we'd know, who originally got it, who they sent it to, that is now registered as part of that. So all the person needs to do is go ahead and click the checkbox. Now, when you were doing the registration, this button actually said register. Because we're live in the webinar, we actually use the same process for joining the webinar itself. And I'll talk about that in a minute through there. So I can go ahead and submit that. And that's just an HTML form that's coming up on our web page, a little bit of JavaScript that pre-populates the form, and then you hit the submit button, sends it to a workflow in the back. So let's actually talk through what that whole integration looks like. So I've got a slide here. It looks a little daunting perhaps, but I'll walk you through sort of left to right of what that journey is. So we started with this marketing email here that got sent from MailChimp. Well, there's a point of integration before that says, hey, our Dynamics 365, we've decided that's our system of record. That's all of our contacts and leads and accounts in there. And we drive that data into MailChimp. And then we can select an audience from that, send it a marketing email that drives people to the public website, just like you saw when I clicked on that email and I opened up the event page. Now, when that form popped up and I fill in my information, I say, yes, I want to join or I want to register for this event, that's actually calling back to a logic app. So I'll show you in a minute what that logic app looks like. But basically what it's doing is it's saying, hey, I need to go back into Dynamics, see if I know this person, because they may have received the email from somebody else. And it's somebody we don't recognize. We want to update that into our CRM. We want to record the fact that they've registered or that they've joined the event. We want to dip into SharePoint and get a calendar invitation that we want to send to those people so that they have the invite in their calendar to actually join the event. And when they come back and it's time to join the event, like we've just done here today, that calendar invitation actually takes you back to that same registration form. And as you saw, it switches into a join. And this is smart enough to say, hey, instead of sending you a calendar invitation, I'm actually going to take you into the Teams meeting itself. And the reason we do that is you can join the meetings anonymously. We want to know who's coming in, so we track them through the website from that point of view. So now you're in the Teams meeting here. When this meeting's over, Teams creates a analytics Excel of who joined, how long they joined for, and such. We actually pull that back in and feed that back into our CRM. So we can see who registered, who joined, how long did they stay in, and such. And then we've got a marketing dashboard that can show us all that visibility. So in fact, let's go over to that dashboard and have a look at that. So I haven't refreshed this just now. We'll need a new data set this afternoon once all the data is in, but we can see here, hey, we've got 40 people registered for this event here. Not one of our bigger ones. In fact, the Power BI one that we did earlier in the year was really popular. We had, I think, close to 150 people register for that. But we can see some of the analytics. So I've in Power BI selected this event here, and then these stats update to show me, it only tells me who's registered, not attended yet, because we don't have those stats just yet. But I can see, how recently did people come to us through here. In this particular webinar, almost everybody is people that we already know that's on our marketing list. It's a fairly bespoke topic of interest more to clients and people we know. If I look at the deployed Power BI one, about a quarter of the people were brand new to us. They had found out from somebody else, or they found out organically and registered through there. So being able to get this sort of analytics in Power BI of what's happening in these business processes is super helpful in terms of how you run your business. So if I come under the hood here and I say, hey, I want to actually look at that logic app. So when I was on that form in the website, so if I go back here for a second, so I've got this form up and I hit that join button, what it's doing is it's triggering this event registration logic app workflow. We can actually see people registering this morning coming through there. And I can edit this logic app. And this is what I mean by a no-code, low-code type of solution. We're not writing code to build this out. It is still fairly technical. So you kind of need to understand how logic apps works to build this out. But you're basically connecting these boxes together, saying, hey, I want you to go through these steps as somebody is registering. So, the initial, I submitted the form, comes into the top of the workflow here. It's got a whole bunch of variables that it needs to set up. We can come a little further down into the meat of it here. We actually use the same workflow, whether you're registering on our Envision IT website, which is the one we use for today's event, or our Extranet User Manager sister website. So it kind of figures out which path you're coming through from there. We can use the same workflow for both. Way down here, we're actually doing a lookup into CRM. So this is actually calling another logic app to say, hey, I know the email address of the person that registered. Go see if they're in CRM. Are they a lead? Are they a contact with an account? Who are they in through there? So it can call out and do that. And we can use that logic app for multiple different things. We do gated content on our website as well. We use the same logic app workflow for that. And it decides, hey, am I a lead or am I a contact? Has this person already registered? Are they heading in a second time as they're joining? So it figures out all of those details and comes down through those paths and updates the, am I joining it? Am I registering it? Is a brand new one and such from there. And then ultimately at the bottom here, it's saying, hey, go into SharePoint, get that email that's associated with this event, get the content that's in that email, compose a body of a calendar, and ultimately just send a calendar invitation out to that person. And this particular step in here is actually wired into Logan's mailbox. When you get those email calendar invites, it's actually from Logan. And it actually shows in his sent box through there, and we can see all the different parameters of, hey, we want it to start and end on this time with this subject, and we want the body that came from, that item that's in SharePoint. So you can wire all this together and make it a very bespoke, customized piece here. So yes, there's some learning curve of how you build these workflows, but again, you're not writing code, you're connecting up different actions and responses through there. Okay, so let's switch gears here. Let's go to the next one we're going to talk about, which is our expense report. Excuse me. Pretty simple. Who are you? We already know because you're logged in, and I'll show you how that works. What period are you filling your expense form in? What are your expenses? Do you have mileages? Because we can do some mileage calculations. In Canada, CRA says reasonable cost is 61 cents per kilometer, so it auto-populates that for you. There is over 5,000 kilometers these days in COVID. We're not getting significant mileages from anybody, so I haven't bothered implementing that part yet, but we could, and we'll talk about how we did for Halton Region for that. and auto-populate all the calculations. So what are some of the things that we need to think about as we're building a form like this? Well, first and foremost, everything you do net new these days, you should really be thinking about mobile friendly, mobile first. There's a lot of your workforce that may be using their iPhone, their Android, what have you, to fill this stuff out. You want it to work well from that point of view. I give a talk on different employee self-service. We've got some past talks links at the end of this deck that I'll share out. One of them is a leave request. For that one, it's very simple. Hey, I just submit my request, and if I change my mind on it, I cancel and I submit a new one. That's pretty reasonable because there's not very many things I need to enter for a leave request. For expenses, though, I mean, somebody could spend an hour if they've done a lot of traveling, getting all the receipts organized, getting everything in there, submit it all, and then say, oh man, I forgot one receipt, I got to go back. To tell them they have to, just submit a new expense report, they'd shoot you. So you have to be able to load up that existing one that you've done, keep it in draft mode, modify it. It may get submitted for approval and rejected because you forgot that receipt, and then you've got to go in and add it and update it, resubmit it. So you need that rich multiple passes through type of workflow as part of that. But once it gets to certain steps, like if my manager has approved it, I shouldn't be able to edit it anymore. Or if finance has approved it, then it's locked to the manager. It's basically done from that point of view. Ideally, you'd want to scan and attach the receipts. The one I'm going to show you for our side doesn't do that. We're planning on adding that in as part of that. Another important thing that you should think about from a records retention point of view, you may need to retain these for 7 years from a legal and tax liability point of view. 7 years from now, are you going to still be using the same system? It's often a good idea to say, hey, well, let's take that output of the system and PDF it and archive it as a record. And then even if this system has changed and morphed and we're not able to pull up that original form anymore, we still got that PDF record from a storage and retention point of view. We use Telpay for our payroll, for our expense payments, our vendor payments and such. We could integrate that in as part of that. We haven't done it here. We're only 21 people. It's not a big deal for Deb, our finance director, to just bang in those numbers as part of that, but it's all doable. And we'll talk again about how we did that with Halton and SAP. So let's have a look at the form itself. So I'm going to start, actually let me start here on our employee self-service home. This is our dev tenant, so this isn't real data. In fact, our submitted leave request here, just quick side journey, this is actually built with Microsoft Forms. So you've got super simple types of integration projects where you just need to capture some information and submit it and run a workflow on it, and they don't need to come back and resubmit it. Take a look at this. I mean, if you haven't used Microsoft Forms, it's really cool and really simple to build a form like this. Literally in 10 minutes, you can have it up and published, and away you go from there. The only challenge is you can't bring any existing data into it. You can't allow people to re-edit once they've submitted. They basically have to submit a new one from there. So it didn't fit for the expense form, but for the leave request, it did work well. But let's come back here and go into our expenses section. So before we jump into the form, let's talk about where this all gets stored. So we're using SharePoint lists to store this data. And I give a deeper talk on employee self-service around folder structure and security and how we have some scripts that run that assign the proper security, because obviously privacy is very important here. You need the staff to be able to see their own stuff. You need their managers and anybody up the reporting chain to be able to see that. You need finance to be able to see everything, or HR. But nobody should see what they're not supposed to see. And we want to keep that as simple as possible. And the way we find that works best is we create folders for each employee and we set the security at the folder level. We have a nightly job that just goes through. So as your reporting structure changes in your organization, a lot of organizations use the manager property in Azure Active Directory to define that. We can feed from that. And again, that becomes our system of record, and that defines all the security here. What I'm seeing here is just out of the box SharePoint list views that I've customized to say, hey, show me my expenses or show me the ones that I have to approve. And actually, if I jump over to the see all here, this will take me into that list with that view as a whole. So I can see my expenses here, and I can just come into the drop down. I can see all the different types of views I've got. Let me just edit this current view to show you under the hood what's going on here. And again, it's that no code theme. We can build these different views, just by clicking some checkboxes and changing the things in SharePoint. We don't need to build any code to do this. What things do I want to show on the view through here. How do I want to sort it? Well, let's put the most recent expense at the top of the list and then descending order from there. How do I want to filter it? This is a neat little trick here. We have an employee column that says, who is this expense form? And we want it equal to square bracket me. And that's a special symbol in SharePoint that says, hey, me means the person that's signed into SharePoint right now. So I only see my records. I don't see any of my direct reports. And this becomes my expenses effectively from there. So I can come back to this view here and see just the ones that are mine through here. I can flip this over to other views to say, hey, I want to look at all by employee. Now, this wouldn't necessarily be all employees. It's only the ones that I have access to, because SharePoint will automatically security trim and only show me the ones that I'm allowed to see. Again, we don't need to build anything once we set the security up properly. That all just comes through for free here. I've only got the one person in there, but I've grouped it by person so I can see it from that perspective. Or maybe I'm Deb, I'm the finance person. I'm going to look at finance approvals and say, hey, what's already been manager approved that's waiting for me to finish off and pay. Typically Deb would go into TellPay and actually enter that payment to be paid to that person and then mark it as finance approved to say, oh, we're done. It's fully approved and paid and all set from that perspective. But if I come back to that main expense landing page here for a sec. So we have the ability to launch a new form. I want to start a brand new expense form. So I go ahead and submit a new expense form, click that link. And what it's doing is it's taking me to another page on this site. And this is, again, just a SharePoint page. The secret sauce here is we're using a special web part that we've created that allows us to embed a form onto the SharePoint page. And it's not just get me the HTML, that form on there, but do it in a way, excuse me, still fighting a bit of a cold here. Do it in a way that it's secure, that we can call things like Logic App workflows as the person who's signed in and know that that zero trust security architecture is in place and working from that point of view. So if I edit this page, and I come over here, you see this is the EIT authenticated editor. So it's a custom web part that we've built. Actually thinking about open sourcing it. So if you think the idea is cool and you'd like to start playing with it yourself, reach out to Logan, let us know. We're certainly open. We've done that in the past for other things like this that we've created. But I can come in and edit this, and there's not a lot of configuration to it. If you want a title on it, I've already got a page title, so I didn't want one. Point to the HTML of the form that you want to put into the web part. So this is just, again, pointing to a piece of HTML that's stored in a library in this site. And this audience one, we can actually simplify and bake this a little deeper in so you don't need to worry too much about it. It's basically the client ID of the app registration and Azure AD, because this is all authenticated. It needs to be tied into Azure Active Directory. So that's what that's doing as part of that there. Let's not actually save changes on this. I'm going to discard changes. That's okay. And come back to the form itself. So there's some things that look quite simple here, like, hey, I've got multiple expenses, and I want to add some additional rows through here or mileage through here. I want to type in some 100 kilometers on this trip and have it auto calculate the amounts as part of that. So there's a little bit of JavaScript that makes that happen. So back to that website developer, you need somebody that can do that kind of forms development. But once you've done this model and you've got one of these built, you can kind of rinse and repeat and copy from there. So if you've got somebody on your team that's good with that sort of front-end web development side of things, building these forms becomes pretty straightforward from that perspective. What I'm actually going to do is come back here and just pull up an existing one as well. So I've got a link here. This is actually just a calculated column in SharePoint that we put a little bit of custom presentation on it. So, again, not code, to provide that edit link. And what it does is it launches that same form that I was just in, but it passes the ID of the expense report that we want to load. And what it's doing is actually calling out to a Logic app to say, go get me that data. We should have some spinners and dialogues in here saying, hey, hang on a second while we go load the data. It did go ahead and do that, so I can see the report data is filled in. The existing expenses and mileages are in there. I can change amounts in there. It updates all my totals and everything else from there. I might want to put some notes in and go ahead and submit that. And when I submit, it's calling to a second logic app to say, go write that data back to that SharePoint list. And all the business rules around, hey, is this, already been manager approved and I'm the employee and I shouldn't be able to save it, that logic app could figure out all those sorts of rules, and it could fail this and say, hey, you're not supposed to be editing this. So the button should even be there for you to save it, but if you somehow hacked it and tried to work around the system, it's still going to catch you and say, no, you can't do that. That's not allowed as part of the security rules that are in place as part of this. So you can really build a robust security model around all of this. So let's have a look under the hood here. If I come to my logic apps, so there's actually a couple here. So there's one which is the get. So I'm loading up an existing form and I want to go get the data for that particular expense form item that we want to see in there. And you can see 1234 that ran. That was me hitting that existing item. So if I look at what that's doing, it's similar concept to what I was showing you on the webinar registration side. It's a series of steps, starting with a trigger that says, hey, the logic app was triggered. I'm going to validate what's called a bearer token. This is how the security works. It's a signed token provided by Microsoft Azure AD that says, hey, this is an authenticated user that's calling you. Microsoft has a bunch of middleware that validates that. So even if you try and hack it, you won't get past the middleware. And then we can look at that and say, we can trust this. We know who's calling us. And then we can go get their employee self-service information, like who's their manager, what's their employee ID, all that sort of stuff. So if I come down here, we know all the details around that person. There's their name, what's it called, their user principal name, the way they log in, what's their employee number, who's their manager ID, all that detail is there. And if there's more that you need to pull out of your HRIS or other systems as part of that, that can all be built as part of the integrations here. And then it's pretty straightforward. Just go get that item from SharePoint and return it back to the form. So you can see all my data in here that's in the form. Even down at the bottom here, it looks a little bit ugly, but the raw data that's get used by the form itself, and just responds back to the front end form. So that's how we populate the data on there. And then the same sort of thing happens on the submit side. So when I hit that submit button to say, hey, I wanted to save my changes, it's calling this workflow and doing a very similar thing. It does the same security checks, says, who are you? We haven't baked in a lot of the security rules to say, hey, are you allowed to do this change depending on what state you're in? That's still a to-do in the workflow. But again, it's just more steps that we need to add in through there to accommodate all that. So it does the same validation, getting your user info, updating some totals and things like that, and then either saving a new item if it's a brand new expense request, or updating the existing item and then responding back from there. So again, you're got these building blocks in logic apps, and the nice thing is when you're working with logic apps, let me actually go into the editor mode here on a minute. I won't make any changes, but to give you a sense of the power of some of the things that it can do through here. So let's say I want to add a new step. I can just hover wherever I want. I get that plus sign, add a new action. And there's literally thousands of connectors and actions. And it's not just Microsoft. I mean, I can say, hey, I want to do something with Facebook or with Salesforce or with SAP. There's connectors for all sorts of different things. Oh, Facebook is Etsy. That's kind of weird. I should try these out before I demo them in the webinars. I know there's a bunch of Salesforce items because we use this on a number of our clients' projects. And you can build custom connectors as well. It's a very extensible model, and it's a great way to build these kind of integrations through here. And then just to, geek out a little bit more on the technology side. So that HTML form that I was showing you on the web page, so the actual expense form itself. I mean, this is just standard out of the box HTML. Now we've got all the different sections for the employee info, the expenses, the mileage, the choice items that are in there. So you build this HTML out. And in our case, we're using a bunch of open source for Bootstrap to make it mobile friendly, and jQuery to make it easier to code. Those are standard free open source pieces that we're using as part of that. And then the secret sauce is that That web part that I was showing you knows to look for certain things like, hey, the script needs to know the bearer token to make the security work as part of that. So that wires it in together as part of that. And then there's a separate JavaScript file that does the loading and the saving as part of that. And again, a lot of this is pretty standard, that once you've built it for one application, and we can provide this as a starting point, it's very extensible from there. In fact, if we come back to the form itself for a second here. So if I just open up my developer toolbar for a second and force this into mobile friendly. So now imagine I'm on my iPhone, my Android device. We haven't done anything different to make this mobile friendly because we've used Bootstrap, which is a responsive framework for building forms and web pages like this. I can simply vertically scroll down through here and everything's stacked and nicely laid out and easy to use on my mobile device. In fact, even if we had the ability to attach receipts and things like that, the nice thing is when you're on your smartphone and you've got, you say, I want to browse for a file, smartphone knows that, hey, maybe you want to take a picture as part of that, and you can actually live be taking pictures of your receipts and attaching them to the form as you're submitting it all through your mobile phone. So it becomes a really nice mobile experience as part of that. Okay, so let's come back here. I've got a diagram that kind of gives you a high-level view of what that looks like. So we've got the SharePoint page with the web part with the HTML expense form on it. When it loads or when I save it, it's talking to a logic app that's talking to that expense list that's in SharePoint. Now, there's some back-end work that sets up all the security that says, hey, let's gather all the employee data from Azure Active Directory or maybe from your HRIS system and set the security property in here. That's part of the solution as well. Now, you can send email notifications to say, hey, this needs to be approved or this just got rejected, what have you. We're actually more a Teams focused organization. We almost do no internal communications through email anymore. So we like to use Teams for that. And there's connectors in Logic App that you can send Teams chats and messages and approval notifications and all that sort of stuff. And then just like I was showing on the marketing dashboard, this can all feed into a Power BI dashboard. Then we can see a high level view. And Power BI is really rich at extracting the full data out of that. So if you want to start to get dashboards that show expenses by category submitted and things like that and start to mash it up organizationally wide, you've got the ability to do all that once you get that data model into Power BI. So there are some to-do items still. I mentioned we don't have the folder security in there and saving into the right employee folder, the adding and removing attachments. The mileage above 5,000 kilometers, I mean, that's a little trickier because we need to look at your past expenses for the year and figure out, are you above or below the 5,000 mark? But it's doable. We did it for all as part of there, getting the approval steps and the Teams notifications in there and really fleshing out the full security on that. I mean, if this one is of particular interest to anybody, we have delivered solutions based off of this for a number of clients, not just Halton. Certainly open to conversations around taking this a little further for you as well. Yeah.
Hey, Peter, there's a question from Doug that I think is good because it relates to exactly what you're talking about. There's lots of moving parts in these different solutions. What kind of maintenance does this take in an ongoing basis?
It's a good question. Thanks, Doug. I mean, it feels like a lot of moving parts, but at the end of the day, you've got an HTML form and you've got typically two logic apps. They're sort of the meat of what's happening here. And what you probably want to do is have some dashboarding or reporting going on in Azure on the logic apps, rather than having to go visit that history of activity. And you may have noticed in there as I was scanning through those logic apps, there were some failures because we were actually doing developments and tweaks as we were going through there. So you'll see that in here. We don't really want to have to check that on a regular basis. So there's a lot of rich tooling in Microsoft to say, hey, roll this up to a dashboard, send alerts out if you see failures in it. So from an IT operations point of view, you can build more around that from that point of view and make it a little easier to manage from that perspective. The other piece I didn't talk about, from a code maintenance point of view, we've got a whole methodology around how we keep the HTML and the JavaScript in Git from a source control point of view, how we can easily deploy that to dev and test and prod environments. And we have the same approach for the logic apps that they can be migrated through those different environments. As this gets more enterprise scale, We often build what are called DevOps pipelines that say, hey, when you check in a change, it can easily get deployed through that pipeline to different environments and make it more maintainable from that point of view. You have to decide, how much is too much for your organization. As you get into larger enterprise type of solutions, that obviously becomes more important. They're running lots of non-production environments. But yeah, it's absolutely something to think about here is, hey, we've got these different moving pieces. How do we make sure they're moving properly? And if something goes sideways, how do we get alerted about that? So on the Halton region side, I mean, it's a very similar form. It was built with the same concept. We didn't have the SharePoint web part at that point in time, so it was a little different that it was hosted outside of SharePoint. They had an additional complexity that they're not fully in the cloud even now. It was about a year and a half ago, so we can actually use Microsoft 365 and SharePoint Online. There was a lot of, on-premises SharePoint 2019 and SQL is part of that mix. On-premises SAP. So, their solution architecture diagram looked a lot more complicated. We have on-premise data gateways to wire this together into SAP and into SQL and into SharePoint on-premises. If I had my dithers, I'd much rather not build something like this. I'd rather be purely in the cloud. It's way simpler to build, and to Doug's point, maintaining it with all these moving parts in the cloud and on-premise becomes trickier as well. But the solution was a big deal to pull together. It took us a while to build it out and get it through all the QA and UAT and deployed live for Halton region. They have about 2,500 staff that are using the form, but successfully rolled out and working well for them now. So it can be done in a hybrid type of model. Just if at all possible, if your staff are all licensed for Microsoft 365, keep it all in the cloud. It just works so much better. I've been given this talk before. I think I feel like I'm going to run out of time here because I'm only about halfway through the scenario. So I may pick up the pace a little bit as we go through here. There's two portals here that I want to talk about, one for Electricity Canada and one for the Ontario Association of Children's Aid Society. They're both not-for-profit associations. Electricity Canada, their members are the large hydro generation like the OPGs and distributions like Toronto Hydros of the world, along with they have corporate partners as well as part of that. So we've got some stats and details around that. But really, I want to talk about, in particular, the contact data. This was a clear example. We started working with Electricity Canada last summer, doing that technology assessment to say, hey, what system do you use today? Do you have a single source of the truth or a system of record? No. And how do we bring that together? Because they were using MailChimp, Salesforce, they had a custom CMS for their existing portal that needed to be retired. They had Outlook distribution lists. There was lots of different places where they had contacts, and there wasn't really any single spot to consolidate that through. So in addition to building the portal, a big part of the exercise here was, how do we consolidate that? How do we clean that data and get to a single version of the truth? And that was tough. We decided, hey, Salesforce is going to become that system of record. But our external user manager product that runs the portal actually becomes the glue that wires all that together through there. So if we look at the Electricity Canada portal itself, for example, so this is the live portal, bilingual. If I mangle up my email address here so it thinks I'm somebody new coming in, it'll drive me into the registration process. And it says, hey, I don't recognize that email domain. I'm going to take you down the public path, but I could flip that over and say, no, I actually work for Hydro One, for example. That would have happened automatically if my email domain matched Hydro One, and all those rules are defined in Salesforce. What are all the different member organizations, corporate partners, and email domains? So Salesforce is the master for all that. And the same logic app concept that I was showing you is what wires this together. When I fill in this registration, if I leave this check saying I'd like to subscribe to the newsletter, and I register this, it's going to update the portal so I can sign into the portal. It's going to update Salesforce. We've got a record of you there. It's going to update into MailChimp so that you're on the newsletter that you subscribed for, and everything drives through there. And as they're doing changes, whether it's me SelfService changing my own stuff or somebody at Electricity Canada making those changes, they drive through the same process and it updates all the systems from there. So it's that idea of saying we've got one place, Salesforce, where that data is mastered and one way of maintaining it, and it pushes out to all the various different areas from there. And Logic Apps becomes a big part of the glue that wires all that together. if we look at their broader integration, it's actually not just Salesforce and MailChimp, but there's a whole learning management side to it as well. So when somebody registers for the course, as well as creating a record in Salesforce and the portal, we're creating a learner record in Moodle, which is an open source learning management solution as part of that as well. We're even doing single sign-on. So when I sign on here, I use those same Azure Active Directory credentials to connect into Moodle through that as well. So a nice example of how to wire a lot of different systems together and get to a single version of the truth. And Children's Aid Society was very much the same. They've got 27,000 members coming in from a lot of different organizations. If we look at their solution architecture, same idea. They've got Desire to Learn, Training Orchestra. Some of their courses are paid, so they have Stripe payment, which Electricity Canada has as well. So how do we connect all that together? Now, this was an older project we did a number of years ago. We built this a lot through C# APIs that we wrote in Visual Studio. In hindsight, if we were doing it today, we'd probably do a lot of that through Logic Apps here as well. It's just an easier way to wire that together and build those connections. But this idea of not having each of these things talk to all the other things, but having something in the middle that connects it all together, that's sort of leading us to that enterprise service bus concept that I was talking about before. If I keep going through examples, Community Living Haldeman. So this was the one that was using Teams shifts. So CLH is a support organization for adults down in the Haldeman region. They are fully in on Microsoft 365. They're using Teams extensively, and this started as a pilot to say, hey, can we use Microsoft Shifts, which is a way to manage shift schedules from a staffing point of view. It's a Microsoft app that's part of Teams. So managers can create their schedules, staff can see or sign up, they can request swaps and changes and time off, and all part of Shifts in Teams. But it doesn't have any payroll integration. It doesn't have any sort of approval processes as part of that. So we built some custom integrations to say, hey, pump all that data into Power BI so we can do reporting and approvals around it. And then ultimately, once it's approved, pump it over into Sage Accounting, which is their ERP system, to actually do the payroll and cut the paychecks as a result of what was done in Shifts through there. So, I mean, this is the out-of-the-box Shifts interface that you see. There's a mobile as well as the main view. You can use it right inside of Teams as well. I mean, full disclosure, we did have a lot of challenges trying to get Shifts to do what they wanted to do from a business point of view, not from an integration point of view. Just, Shifts is fairly simple, and Community Living Haldeman needs different types of shifts. Is it a regular? Is it an overtime? Is it unpaid or paid time off? What location is it? They need to track all that, and we need to find a way to do all of that in Shifts, because we didn't want to extend and go outside of that. We wanted to achieve that all out of the box in Shifts. It took us a few passes, but we did get there. And then we said, okay, now we've got all that data in Shifts. We want to pull it into a SQL database down here so we can use it in dashboards for reporting and for approvals. And we also want to pull in from their HRIS and Azure Active Directory some staff information. We want managers to be able to bring in their budget so they can do budget versus actual staffing comparisons as they're doing their approvals. Even recruiting data comes in through there. So as a pay period ends, there's a workflow that says, hey, these are the managers. I'm going to send them all notifications of what they need to approve for the different homes. And those notifications actually drive to a Power BI dashboard. So that manager can see a high level dashboard that says, okay, this is what's in that pay period. And they can drill in as needed to say, hey, is there something that's misreported there that we need to go back in Shifts and fix up and repeat that process until it's all set to go. We can hit the approve button, and then that can generate CSVs that go over to Sage to say, hey, that's what actually needs to cut from a paycheck point of view. We actually feed that Sage data back into the Power BI model so we can kind of close the loop from a reconciliation point of view as well. So taking an out-of-the-box product from Microsoft and saying, okay, now how do we integrate that with our business processes? That's what this is all about. This one here, I mentioned, Canyon Simcoe asked us to do this in a hustle. We pulled it together. We actually used the same web part that I was showing you for the expense form. And let me pull it up here quick. It's pretty straightforward. It's basically show me a table of all the staff that report to me or anybody who reports to me and what's their vaccination status. So just like the expense form, when I refresh this, it's calling a logic app. In their case, their data lives in a SQL server. So we reach into that SQL server, which is something logic apps can do very easily. figure out who reports to that person, what's their vaccination status, return that data, and we're using a commercial tool called Kendo that gives us this grid here that we can present all the people that work for that person that signed in. These are just made up names in here. But then very easily they can actually come in here and say, hey, you want to change that from not vaccinated to first dosed, following another logic app that says go update that data back in SQL and record that change. So if I refresh this, we should see that first dose stick as part of that. So same model, we've got a logic app that says go get me the data that I need for this form, and another logic app that says, hey, somebody changed it, make sure they're allowed to make that change and update it back into that system of record from there. We even use this model in our own product itself. So this is our X-Ray User Manager product. So I come back over here again. This is our main admin part of it. So if I come into this add new group section here, we've got a number of integrations into third-party products like Orchestra or Valo, which are great products for managing governance around Teams and Microsoft 365. And one of the scenarios is, hey, I want a new group that I want to use with external users through our External User Manager product, but I want it built in a particular way. Maybe I've got a committee template. This is connected to our open source. Maybe we're using Orchestra or Valo to do that. That says, hey, I need a team set up this way and a SharePoint set up this way, and then we'll bring the external people in through there. So it's a nice way to tie the two products together. And it's the same model. This, just a simple HTML form that would allow you to upload to SharePoint, and our product reads that, presents the form, and then it does the same idea. When I hit the submit button, it calls a logic app. There's a bearer token. We know it's secure, and does whatever it needs to do to make that integration happen from that point of view. And last one real quick here, just from a massive scale point of view, the same approach. Obviously more development and more technology involved here. I mean, this is a large public insurance company processing 60,000 claims a year and literally millions of records, documents that need to get stored and properly tagged as part of the solution. It's not as simple a solution. It has what's called an Angular application, which is the front end. Think of that like the HTML form. And instead of logic apps, we've actually got a .NET API that we built as part of that, because it's got to wire in through their enterprise service bus to all these different claim systems and SQL and SharePoint. There's a lot of complexity going on through here, but the same model is the same. It's a zero trust architecture. You've got a front end forms side to it. You've got an API piece to it and a single point of integration to all the various different systems here. This project took over a year to complete, but that was migrating 30 million records into SharePoint Online and building the scale to support that sort of solution. Just quick, this idea as you're doing that assessment, whether you're doing it yourself, engaging us or somebody else to help you with that, recognize that you're probably going to break that up into phases and spread that over months, if not years, as you're thinking about, okay, how do we transition to the cloud and to a modern architecture? From a next steps point of view, I mentioned we'll be publishing up the slides and the recording. If you've got other topics or you want to dive deeper into any one of these here, by all means, reach out to us as part of that. If you're interested in the assessment, absolutely look at that as well. From an upcoming talks point of view, I'm going to be giving one just under a month from now on Azure B2B and guest management practices. So we talked about a couple of portals and external. That's going to be more focused on that. I'm actually going to be talking on that external user concept as well as conference in Copenhagen. So kind of excited to be getting back out in the real world and doing real events. More for reference, there's a whole bunch of past webinars and events that we have up on our site that are related to this topic. There's about 3 slides here of things to look through if you want to dive into various different areas from that perspective. I know I've been going pretty rapid pace here. Apologies on that. But if there are further questions here, if we're out of time, we can absolutely take those offline as part of that as well. I see Doug typing. I'm not sure if he's got a question out there. Microsoft costs for the last organization. You mean the big, massive enterprise application? I mean, they already had Microsoft 365 for the organization, so there weren't really costs there. It was really more the costs of hosting the technology in Azure that was part of that. Even that one's a hard one to get into. I mean, these are getting into multi-million-dollar projects at this point here, so they're pretty significant. The operational costs on that, I don't really have visibility onto that side of it, sorry. So Logan, I think we're at a wrap there. We've just hit top of the hour, so we're on our 1 hour mark. I want to thank everybody for joining us this afternoon. And as I mentioned, you know, if you've got specific questions or you want to dive deeper, because I know I went pretty quickly through a bunch of topics there, by all means, reach out to Logan. Happy to have those conversations. Thanks, everybody.